She'd like to hear the ocean song again, snap mountain trails that touch the wind, cast her heart down long winding country roads. From this window frame are sunset views, tapestries of places new, and the colors of a world she longs to know.
Plus, we're under the shades of these magnificent valley oaks.
Yeah.
They've been providing this shade for a few hundred years in this spot. So
Nice.
This is even on the hottest days.
You can just imagine all the different people that sat under there eating or doing whatever.
If these trees could tell us, it would be an incredible story.
Yes.
So Mike's going to tell you a little bit about the fort, then we're going to go through the Quartermaster shops. So Mike, without further ado, I'm going to kind of pan through so you can see what the fort looks like.
All right.
Some of these buildings you may be familiar with. So there's barracks number 1, which we did a few weeks ago. We went on a tour through there.
Okay.
Here are the ruins of barracks number 2, kind of in that fenced in area there. Then you can see the top of the parade grounds going into Officers Row. So the barracks number 1 and then the barracks, the building that you see behind the officers' quarters right there are 2 of the oldest buildings here at the fort and in Kern County. The only one that would be older is probably the Glenville Adobe, which is completely other side of the county. But so Mike, without further ado, he'll give you a little introduction to the fort and then we'll get started.
All right. Well, again, welcome to Fort Tejon State Historic Park. As Lori mentioned, I'm part of the park staff. I'm the state park interpreter for this park. I'm, as you noticed as well, I'm decked out in the regulation mid-1850s U.S. Army attire prescribed for the United States Dragoons and Mallet Force, commissioned by Congress in the 1830s. I'll be kind of going between my first-person role as Corporal Deagon, my pseudo rank, and my role as state park interpreter in the 21st century. So this kind of, but you know what? This is sometimes, a lot of times, this is my other work uniform. I'll wear this more than my tan green ranger uniform. And although it's hot out, it's kind of fun to take that time travel mentally back into the mid 19th century. And so this is part of a series that we've been doing about Fort Tejon and very specific stuff on unique sections of the park, the fort, and its structures and the roles they played and what was done within them. And as Lori mentioned today, we're going to take a look at the role, which is still a role in active Army post today, of the quartermasters, shops, area, depots, different names they have for it. But basically the role of the quartermaster within the U.S. Army, especially here at Fort Tejon. Before we delve into that, though, as always, let me give you, for those who are just joining us or haven't joined us before, let me give you a brief intro about Fort Tejon and why it's here, why it's a park now, and why we interpret this. So the short story of the long story is that for eons, this was a Native American site. Various tribes had been using it. We know that this is kind of a meeting spot of a variety of different cultures of Native Americans. Eventually the Spanish come and settle this area, institute the mission system. Then it becomes part of Mexico for several decades after the revolution. And then after the war with Mexico, this becomes part of the United States according to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So we generally interpret 1856 here. So if I were in my first person role, I would say about 6 years ago, the treaty was signed. Well, actually 7 years ago, 1848, 8 years ago, the treaty was signed with Mexico. Just 2 years later, in 1850, September 9th, 1850, there's enough people that have come here because of this little occurrence called the gold rush, that this has enough people to officially be admitted as a state within the Union, okay? So once it becomes an official state of the Union, the government is sending all sorts of agents and services and so on out here to help institute the law of the land, the Constitution, help settle it as the United States. And oftentimes the Dragoons, for example, were found themselves as this role of referee between this incredible time of change. You have all of these native Californios that have been living out here for generations. You have these Native American tribes that have been out here for eons. You now have all these gold rushers coming from the east, from South America. You start to have the Chinese to move in, and it's just incredible of flux. Okay, so in 1854, 2 years ago, the U.S. Dragoons, the U.S. government and Indian agents signed a treaty which never gets ratified by the Senate, which they never told those tribes about, with 6 different Yokutt tribes down in the lower San Joaquin Valley. And they agreed to move on to a reservation, the San Sebastian Indian Reservation, about 20 miles over those hills from the fort there. And the government policy at the time was usually to place military posts near these reservations with 2 missions in mind. Again, mostly as referee. They were here to protect them, to keep them from being impeded upon by these gold-hungry gold rushers and all these new settlers moving in, but also to protect those folks. In other words, to control them, as they put it, to keep them from reacting to these encounters and incursions and creating unrest and war and so on and so forth. Oftentimes, the Dragoon was almost like half the time they were kind of a diplomatic corps, going out and kind of showing the power of the United States, these new tribes, but at the same time protecting them and their interests as well, and then all the United States other folks that are moving into the state. So in 1854, late 1854, the Dragoons show up here. They start building this post, and their main mission is to protect and control the nearby Native American tribes. But in this area that's beyond the West in those days, remember, Arkansas, Kentucky, Illinois, those are Westerners. When the Civil War were to comes around a decade later, in 1860s, that's the Western theater. So what do you call half a continent beyond that? It's like what we would think of today as Guam, exotically far west. But here they were in this exotic far west land, and then they placed this post, of all places, in this remote mountain range. But it's strategically placed between that little town you guys may have heard of down the hill in 1856, about 2,000 people, called what was it? Pueblo de Los Angeles, I think. Yeah, little town. And then on the other end is the Great San Joaquin Valley. So if you don't want to go all the way around through the Owens Valley or along the coast, this is kind of the main route. It had been traveled by Native Americans for eons. The Spanish knew it as a route. In 1853, the year before, it was surveyed for a railroad route. Turns out the railroads decided to go through the original Tejon Pass near Tehaspie, where the 58 freeway comes out now, but they didn't know that at the time. So it's a strategic communication route. They're placed here so they can kind of react to issues going on in either end. And while they're here, their mission blossoms. At different times, they were sent down to that little town called Pueblo de Los Angeles and another tiny little coastal town you may have heard called Santa Barbara, to put down riots going on between these new American settlers moving in and the native California population. They were sent out to the Utah Territory at one point to deal with what they called the Mormon issue, to investigate the Mountain Meadows massacre. And again, a lot like with the Native American tribes, overall, the Mormons, with the power of the United States, would help them realize that they're going to be part of the United States, not a separate kingdom. That's a whole other story. They caught cattle rustlers in the San Fernando Pass, turned them over to the local sheriff at the time, who, sheriff of Los Angeles at the time, county, used the jail here as a local holding cell because they didn't have them enough in this area. They were sent down into what they called the Tule River War during 1856. Again, by the time they got there, it was over. Incursions and troubles between gold rushing native settlers or moving in American settlers and the Native Americans as well. In addition, they contributed to social life. This was the 3rd most populous settlement in California in the 1860 census, believe it or not. Now, for the purposes of the census, Tejon, the town of Tejon, roamed all the way down a little bit into the San Joaquin Valley and all the way through the mountains down into what we call Castaic today. So it was a bigger area, but that made it the 3rd populous settlement in California at the time. Just tells you how sparsely populated the state really was. So it was kind of a cultural center in a way. Army was spending money here just like today. Around our military bases today, if soldiers are being paid, the government spending money, towns show up nearby. They went to these towns, Pueblo de Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, and so on. The band, who were known to be a bunch of characters here, had a dramatic society, would also go down there to celebrate national holidays, 4th of July. They would hold concerts and so on. So it played an important role in helping settle, maintain law, establish this as a United States state, and help it grow right up until about the arrival of the Civil War. The Civil War has this regiment leave this post. They're ordered back east for the big fight. California troops recruited from around the state, who would essentially be today the National Guard, were not unlike today, federalized in emergency situations like that, and used as U.S. troops, keeping basically the west coast of the continent on the side of the U.S. And at one point in 1863 to 64, about a year, they re-garrisoned this post, these California troops, infantry, not dragoons like us, mounted soldiers, dealing with a Paiute Indian uprising in the Owens Valley. They force-marched them here, kept them here as POWs for a year, nearly starved them to death, and eventually sent them on to reservations and went down to Los Angeles. After that, it's officially closed. From there, Tejon, what becomes Tejon Ranch, put together by Edward Beale, this was purchased by them, returned to the local ranchers with the improvements as payments, since the Army never worked out a formal lease with them. And then it comes the 20th century. There's an interest on the behalf of Californians, especially in Bakersfield, about preserving the heritage of this area. And so in 1940, it becomes a park. And ever since then, we've been seeking to tell the story of the first regiment of the United States Dragoons, the Native American tribes have been here, the ranching period, etc. So today our focus, with all that underfoot, today our focus is on the role of the quartermaster. Now, some things, as many veterans will tell you, just don't change with the military. A lot of things do, but some don't. There's still a quartermaster today. Every post has his quartermaster, and that guy is in charge of basically supplying the fort. The quartermaster will make contracts and make sure that supplies are brought in for ammunition, for building supplies, for weapons, for uniforms, and he will assign people to those roles. Okay, here at Fort Tejon, this post kind of spans kind of a mountain canyon or mountain valley, I guess you could say. Now, the side that we're on right now, and you can see behind me, is kind of generally referred to as the residential end. We have the officers' quarters, we have the two barracks, hospital over there, the mess halls, things used for living, kind of the residential end. As you go across the stagecoach route, the I-5 today, that was kind of what we call the working end. And that's where the quartermaster kind of ruled over there. They were his shops. He had the blacksmith shop, they had the corrals where they kept the horses, the mules, they had the place where they kept their feed. The blacksmith was there, they had the carpentry over there, they had their extra storehouses eventually. The telegraph that would come through here in 1860 is set up there. And the overland route stagecoach that came through here that brought the mail through here and passengers had a station here where they would actually change out the horses, stop off, drop off the mail. So that's kind of the working, practical end of the fort. And what we're going to show you today is an interpretive version of that. That part of the fort on the other side of the stagecoach route is owned by Tejon Ranch now. It's not part of the park, but it's an essential portion of any military post, even today. So what we have is an interpretive version here, built like you would have probably found on most mid-19th century forts. And in there, we have hands-on stuff. We have carpenters, saddlery, blacksmiths, and so on that work in there just as they would have worked 150 years ago. And these are essential parts of a fighting command, which I'll describe to you later. Maybe we could pan, I mean, it's hard to see, but you can kind of, maybe you can kind of see across through those trees, or try to imagine. There's a low point where the Grapevine Creek goes across, and then the stagecoach route, of course. And then up on the hills where you find Tejon Ranch headquarters stay. Huge ranch, 450,000 acres.
So basically, right in this, behind this big giant oak tree is the area we're talking. You can see this drainage coming down, and there's a big flat area behind that oak tree.
And they had that's where you found their storerooms, like I said, their granary, their corrals, the blacksmith shop, the farrier, storerooms, offices, all sorts of stuff. So definitely a working end of the post. Okay. Now, before we go on into the building, does anybody have questions about Fort Tejon, the quartermaster, why we built this park, anything like that?
Somebody had a question. Let me see if I can pull it up without losing you guys here. Right. Let's see. Chat. Is that sword you have real or just a costume prop?
Oh, good question. Well, it's a little bit of both. This saber is the model 18. Let me take the saber out of the scabbard. So we have a scabbard that holds the saber. We actually have the saber itself. So this saber was not made 150 years ago. This saber is probably reproduced probably about 2 decades ago, but it's made just as the Army would have made it 150 years ago. So can I fight with it? Can I harm somebody with it? Can I defend myself with this? Absolutely. We follow the manual that they use, and we train to fight like they did. So it's a real saber. But is it 150 years old? No. So hopefully that answers your question. It's probably, I love the saber. You know, if a dragoon lost all his other weapons, you shot all your ammunition, your pistol's broken, you're out of ammunition for your musketoon, the cannon, the enemy's too close for the cannon, every dragoon could fall back on his basic weapon, which is the saber. This saber was kind of a favorite among them. It served for a long time. A lot of the old dragoon officers that served in the Civil War carried the old model 840 heavy cavalry saber. It's copied after a French 1822 saber, very similar to it. And it's a saber. It has a blade on one side, not sharp though, right? Won't cut you. It's made so that you can bludgeon someone with it. And it has a very sharp point though. And so there's been called the point, where you can run them through with it. And of course, there's different ways of blocking with it as well. If nothing else, the dragoon was trained because they were primarily mounted soldiers. They were trained to fight on horseback with these, among all the other weapons they were trained with as well, to fight on the frontier, kind of their own expeditionary.
Is it difficult to sharpen the saber?
No, if you have a sharpening stone, we find some originals that do have blades on them. Certain company officers would have their men sharpen it. They never came from the arsenal sharpened; they were left dull. Because if you have a sharp edge that gets stuck in an enemy bone, you're going to leave your saber with them and become disarmed. But if I can break something with this, I've disabled the enemy.
And how about the little black pouch on your belt? What was that used for?
This is called a cap pouch. This is part of the ammunition. So inside, I don't think I have any with me at the moment. It's the ignition piece to the gunpowder. When I load my weapon, I have gunpowder and a lead ball in there, and I have to ignite that powder in an explosive way to send the bullet out at hundreds of feet a second at the enemy. To do that, we have a cap, kind of like your cap, like cap guns today, a little louder, so that when the hammer of the weapon hits the cap, it explodes it. That explodes the powder and sends the bullet downrange. And then, so that's half the ammunition there, just to shoot one bullet. The other half is on my back in a bigger pouch. That carries the gunpowder and the bullets. So cap pouch, cartridge box. Good
Okay,
questions.
are you ready to see the inside of the Quartermaster shops?
I am.
Sure thing.
Let's
All right,
go.
follow me. Okay. So what we're going to do is go ahead inside. The first area you're going to see is the quartermaster's office. So it would have been an officer, commissioned officer, in charge of basically accounting for all these sort of supplies, contracts, and bringing them in. And he had to have, just like today, an office where he kept those kind of records and corresponded with different depots like Benicia near San Francisco, or down in Wilmington where most of their supplies were coming from when they were offloaded on this other little town called San Pedro at the time, separate town from Los Angeles. So it was a long route, an expensive route to supply Fort Dun, because they had to come basically by being offloaded at San Pedro to the depot in Wilmington. Then about a 2-week wagon ride either through Cajon Pass or San Francisco Pass up to the fort here by wagon. And this guy was the guy helping coordinate all this, saying, here's what we need, here's what we received, here's what you need to send next time. Okay. So come on in.
And when was this building built?
Well, this particular building, if I'll step out, so in my 21st century interpreter role, they started building this, putting together plans for it, commissioning it in 1992. And I remember last being finished, the last of the details kind of being put in here in about 1998. So probably over a 6-year period in the mid-90s. And you'll notice the lumber in particular, they took care. This is rough cut lumber, right? So most lumber we get today is very smooth. This is done in the old style where it's left very rough as it would have come from the sawmills nearby here in Mount Pinos. Today it's interesting in that if you want rough cut lumber like this, you have to pay extra. The smooth lumber, which used to be so expensive then and rare, is now so common today that this is the rarity. So this took quite a bit of endeavor to research and put together.
And is this based on historical information, the layout of this building?
This is because it's not in the original location. Part of the plan, the agreement was the Parks asked for was that it be created general seen in a mid-19th century army post, as opposed to exactly what you found at Fort Dun. This is where you would have found an officer, usually a captain, sometimes a major, Sometimes lieutenants were left in charge. And just examples of stuff you find in a typical storeroom. We don't have our wood stove hooked up yet. That would be essential in the winters here. The lighting at the time, of course, is either by your fireplace or in this case, kerosene lamp. And of course, he's the quartermaster. So kind of like today, if you have a storehouse, a place where you bring in a warehouse, you're gonna have lots of boxes and stuff. The cardboard box in those days was actually wooden crates and barrels. So after you depleted its contents, they're not really looking for you to send them back. They don't recycle them like we do the cardboard today. A lot of times you'll have a lot of that stuff lying around. And a lot of this, especially the cardboard boxes, would be used. They didn't want to waste. That you would use that as your kindling and your fire starter. Now what we'll do next, we're going to go to this next room. This is the tack and saddlery shop. Okay, come on in. And I really wish we had like a smell sensor that we provided with this online presentation, because when you walk in here, you can smell the character of the old building, right? The wood and so on. But on top of that, in here, there's an incredible smell of leather, right? Lots of hide and different types of hides and leatherware and stuff like that. So you're seeing on the shelves here stuff that the tack master or the saddlery sergeant would be working with. There's lots of brass pieces like the belt plates and so on that they've got to make a new belt for because it's snapped or wore out. You can see the cartridge boxes that need repair. You can see some of the tools they use, the awls, the heavy sewing items, the cobbler's hammer even, used for shoe repair. All would have been done right in this area. Remember that in the mid-19th century, a lot of our gear, like you see me wearing, is made of leather, right? Including our saddles. Now, just like today, this is a fighting command. So the Army makes sure at any time that the quartermaster especially and other people maintaining equipment, that command is ready, their equipment is ready if they're called out at any time by Congress or the president to fight. They need to be ready to go. So this stuff is not just a nice little kind of trade stuff or on the side stuff or hobby. There had to be someone always assigned to saddlery and tack work, because they had to make sure that the ammunition pouches, our cap boxes, our saber belts, our saddles were ready to go. If we're called out, that's essential fighting equipment, okay? And you'll see as well over on the wall here, lots of different types of tack as well. So this is good examples of stuff that would be used to haul our howitzer, and also stuff that would be used by the mules, for example, to haul the wagons that are coming up here. You can see some old tack on the floor. The quartermaster, the Army was very, very, very frugal. They kept track of every penny back then. And so they might recycle some of that leather to repair some of the other leather. They're probably having, you see a number of hides lying around here. They would have been cutting out new stuff or parts that they're making them here on site, sewing them together, adding them to the saddle and the leather equipment. Granted, the depots, Benicia, Wilmington, the supply depot in Los Angeles, would have been sending gear and equipment up, but they would have been expected to try and maintain it until the new gear arrived or could be ordered. Okay.
I once was helping some friends insulate their attic, and when we went up, we found between the struts was horsehair.
Wow. You know,
that was an old house.
Good thing that you mentioned that. Horsehair was actually a common insulation and stuffing. We find uniforms, original uniforms from the era, and in the chest, to kind of give it a pronounced chest, that Army, that military look, they will sometimes stuff them with horsehair. It was a common use of padding or insulation. It's good that, thank you for mentioning that. All right. So that's kind of an overview of the tack master, the saddlery shop. Oh, here's an interesting little snippet I'll tell you from Fort de Home. There's a story from one of the soldiers, and I forget his name off the top of my head, but we have his written account. I think they're in the National Archives now. Anyways, there's an account from a soldier where he says that he was working in the saddlery shop, so he had been assigned to make sure this military equipment is in good shape and ready to go. And the way he said a Spaniard entered the shop, because apparently they have some worked on. And so apparently they could, in their own free time, independently contract as well. But he came in to have some shoes worked on, and so the soldier quoted him a price and so on, and he went to pay for it. and he said that he dropped one of his gold coins, and the soldier saw where it went, but it was out of view. And so they immediately set to the ground looking for it, trying to find it. He tried to help the Spaniard and convinced him that it had fallen between the floorboards of this shop and that it couldn't be retrieved. So he gave up, paid him with another coin, had his shoe fixed, and move on. And the soldier said that later that night he went back to where he knew the coin had fallen and grabbed it and kept it for himself. So it shows you they were enterprising shenanigans going on here at the fort, with even within a place like this, the saddlery shop.
I would call that enterprising.
To be polite, to be easy going on, yes. But kind of stuff, they're the humans, kind of the daily life stories that we're always after, that kind of helps bring this to into reality, realizing that these guys were a lot like us. All right, so we're going to go into the next shop. This is the Carpenter Shop. So now again, I wish we had the smell sensory addition to our presentation. If you walk in here, we talked about the smell of wood in there, but in here you really have the smell of wood, because you constantly have stuff being cut and shaved and sanded and so on. So this is where all things wood went on. So Mrs. Gardner, remember we talked about in our last presentation, Mrs. Gardner's furniture went to the bottom of the sea on their way out here in one of the sinkings of the ship she came out on. This is where they would have built her new furniture. Okay, so all things wood that the Army needed, parts of sheds and fences and furniture, all sorts of stuff. Now you'll see on this wall, this is stuff used to process some of the rough lumber. So they did have a sawmill operating nearby, but if you were to have, if you didn't have that option of the sawmill being available, or you needed additional processing, you got a lot of soldiers with hands, you're trying to keep out of trouble, you can give them some of these broad axes and these froes, which will process the lumber and cut down a rough cut log into a piece of lumber that you can use. You can see bits and pieces of remnants of lumber along our shelves here, items that have been cut, some they've saved, some will become firewood. Some of this, when we have our student living history program, kids come here, 4th and 5th graders come and spend the night. They will use this wood to do a small carpentry project like would have been done on the frontier. Typically, they'll make wood their own toolboxes, for example. Okay? So you can see the broad axes, the froes, the adzes, all sorts of stuff used to process the rough lumber. Once you got it into lumber form, you're going to use some of these tools over here. So you'll have your workbenches of various types here, and you'll have items like the planers, for example, to smooth out, to take that rough cut lumber and make it a bit smoother, right? You'll also have your different measuring devices to get those precise measurements. No power tools, no plugs in these days. This is all elbow grease power. Okay? You'll also see on the wall here the various saws that we'll use, that the kids use when they make their projects. So cutting the different angles and sizes of lumber that you made. You also have the draw knives to smooth out rougher lumber as well. You'll also see some of our bigger saws. So if some of these oaks drop a limb or two, while the Army's going to preserve the big oak, they may want that limb. And so they're going to process that up for firewood or possibly for lumber as well. So you see some of our 2-man large saws that we've actually used out here. Everything you've seen here is usable or has been used. It's hands-on, not just a display. Okay. When you come on over this way, you'll see more items. So
I'm just going to pan on this real quick for a second so you can get a close-up view of these tools here. So these are the planers. This is a measuring device. Here's some square nails.
Oh yes. Now, believe it or not, there are companies that still make these today, and these are almost the exact same type of nails we find in the archaeology today. They're all over the fort, a bit more rusted, and they show their wear. But these are the same ones we use when we do our projects that they would have used over 160 years ago. And then you'll see on the wall the various wood mallets. You'll also see a lot of our what am I trying to say? Wedges.
Here's a whole set of
files.
chisels.
Chisels, that's it. And my favorite, I think that really makes the kids work, are hand drills as well. As you can see, elbow grease power. Hope you had your breakfast in the morning, right? And you can actually lean into it as well. With the device, almost like a device. So, and then I should, similar to this, we have augers. So no mechanical advancement. So you might have a very serious older build as well. This is just a auger. It's always fun to watch about 2 or 3 4th and 5th graders try to make this work when they've never used one of these in their life, especially when they're used to power tools. But you know, this is what craftsmen think. And we recently came across some of the roles of workers being used up. And apparently, and from the art that's been done as well in the buildings, they were bringing master craftsmen up here. They weren't just soldiers. Soldiers were helping as well, had skills as well, but they were contracting with master craftsmen, master carpenters, masons, and so on, to help build these buildings, the furniture, different things that had to be made here. So these are guys that would have been well trained in these tools, had used them all their lives, and were part of their career. And you'll see
on my grandfather's brace and bit to my son.
What's that?
I passed on my grandfather's brace and bit to my son.
Oh, very good. Yeah. It's fun to come across some of that old stuff even today, and we try to acquire that and bring it here and kind of help generations that are becoming less familiar with them, just how they work and the role they played in craftsmanship. You'll see, here's a good example of how they make wood shingles or roof shingles. They'll take a piece of wood and they will use the frog, kind of that long edge, large tool you saw up there, and they will use it, pound it down, and split it to make wood for the roofs. Handmade. You'll also see on the wall several of the tools used to haul big logs. So if that big limb comes down and they need to move it, they need to position it for the sawmill, or for even to bring it here on post to be processed, you can use items like this. These are still items you will find in logging camps today.
Is that a peavey?
Yes, one of them is called a peavey, yes. Different types. Some of them are made for a single person use, some of them are kind of a crew served item. And of course, our ever-present light. No electrical light switches in here. Candle power if you're doing a late shift. All right, any questions before we move into the blacksmith and farrier shop? Yep, and a lot of those tools you saw when we first entered here, some of the lumber processing tools, those are the kind of stuff, if they were lucky, they would have. Some of those people who truly went out in the frontier and built, you know, the classic American log cabin, this is the kind of stuff that they would have been working with if they had these tools. If nothing else, at least those rough lumber processing tools to get a basic home created.
Back then, a man's forearm would be about the size of his leg. I mean, these were really,
you probably had some ones. I think partly why the diet back then would probably kill you today, and that it seemed like they were eating a lot of things. There were a lot of high calorie items and a lot of fat involved in the diet, but you really didn't a whole lot of folks back then. I think the lifestyle had you burning and needing all those calories.
Yeah.
To survive out here. Remember, there's no infrastructure out here. There's no freeway, no AM/PM gas stations, 911. In fact, the Dragoons were the 911. When people needed help, they called. Messages were sent to Dragoons. Now, response time might be about 2 weeks, but nonetheless. But here they are beyond the frontier, and this is when the Dragoons show up here, they showed up to a mountain meadow, and they were told to build a fort. And so it was craftsmen like this that they were bringing in along with the soldiers that eventually created what became a fairly substantial military post. Good point. All right, let's take a look at the blacksmiths and farrier shop. Now, part of maintaining this fighting command, if you have a lot of horses and soldiers and your troops are mainly trained to be transported and fight on horseback, then your horses, your mules, are essentially what today would be to the Army as trucks and tanks. You had to keep them ready, in good order, and ready to, and running. Part of helping a horse traverse these kind of landscapes and distances is keeping them shoed. So one of the main things that the farrier / blacksmith had to work on was horseshoes, and that involved, you know, trimming horses' hooves and so on, but also bending nails, iron, making shoes, and so on. They were also repairing things like parts of wagons. They were repairing parts of the mountain howitzers they had here. All things iron and metal they would have been working on in a shop like this. This also functions on the side as our wheelwright shop. So these wagons making this traverse over these hills, across the Antelope Valley, up through the pass, all the way from Wilmington and San Pedro, took some wear. And we have an account, we know this because we have an account at one point in the late 1850s, I think, where the quartermaster here sent 60 wagons down to that little town called Pueblo de Los Angeles to have them worked on. So the chances are they had a wheelwright here. They were probably maintaining basic stuff, but it seems at some point they actually had to call in a contractor, kind of like the Army does today, and send several of their trucks or their wagons down to be worked on. Okay, so this is kind of the blacksmith, farrier / wheelwright shop. So come on in and watch your step. So mentioning such, right behind me here is one of those Army, mid-19th century Army trucks. This is actually meets Army specifications. This was produced for us probably about a decade ago by, believe it or not, someone who still makes these in the same style they were made over 106 years ago. And this is a regulation Army Escort wagon. Now, there were different wagons that were probably coming up here. People probably had their different transit vehicles. We know that there were freight wagons coming here, much bigger than this, carrying a lot more weight. But this is kind of like your standard Army truck. And it was usually hauled by 2 to 4 mules, roughly. And even colors, we actually had to research the colors to meet the regulations. You think, oh, well, the Army is just wood, right? Well, they wanted to protect it. They painted it. So all the running gear, so the wheels, and anything that has to deal with the moving running gear underneath has been painted kind of this, it's kind of, I don't know, a dark, kind of a brownish reddish color, roughly. And that regulation actually continues after the Dragoons were here. And then what we like to call Prussian blue for the body as well. And again, you can see all the ironware that would have been produced and shaped. This stuff was beautifully made by that vendor that we found that made that. And all sorts of little practical things. Remember, there's no brakes. So if you're going downhill, like from the pass here towards the San Joaquin Valley, you don't have brakes. And your horses, if they get scared or they get spooked, they're going to run. That's their instinct. So typically what they would do is they would lock wheels in place, and you would drag this wagon down a steep mountain pass. You would actually drag it down so that the horse didn't get off, the wagon didn't get out of control, and your teamster, who was probably one of the best swearers in the Army to get those mules moving, had control of this. Like today, they were drivers. They were trained for a specific trade the Army needed. Okay, so the wheelwright shop. These were constantly coming back and forth to Fort Tejon Supply Depot. Fort Tejon remains today one of the most expensive posts for inflation that the Army ever had to supply. Okay. You'll also see to us, which we'll probably present more in another presentation, one of our 2 mountain howitzers. This is the artillery post, the long-range fight. The Dragoons are
so cute.
They can go off and fight like infantry. They were trained as mounted soldiers, and they brought their own long-range artillery. Okay, but you can look at all these iron pieces that belong on here, right? These break when they move around, and you use them and you fire it. So the blacksmith in here was preparing things like this as well. We know the Dragoons had 2 of these as well, and this one actually finally meets regulation. They were told to paint the bright bronze barrels black so they weren't such a good target from long range. And the quartermaster complains in one of his inspections of Fort Tejon that they still hadn't painted the barrels. But this one has finally been brought up to regulation. This is our vent hole where you fire the cannon from, kind of like the same spot you would use the cap on the musketoon. All right, so again, if we had the sensory function on our presentation, and here you would smell again the wood of the Carpenter Shop, but I think you would also probably have a sense of I don't know, it smells like iron in here. There's kind of that metallic taste smell in here, right? Rightfully so for a blacksmith shop. So come on over this way. Darker, can we see okay? Okay, good. So this is a blacksmith's forge, right? So in here, normally, if we had our blacksmiths working, you can see the coal. Let me grab some coal for you. Okay. Most coal has been burnt up. So this is what we call this a clinker. It's actually really light. It's almost like pumice. Most of the material that we would burn out of it has been burned out. All the heat's been taken out of it. And so it's this really light leftover residue, and you can see a lot of the metallic stuff that's in the coal when they mine it. This stuff we throw out. I'll show you some of the better coal over there. But this stuff once we get the fire going, this will exceed, you get a good hot fire, this will exceed 2,500 degrees, in excess of that. So, and the way the blacksmith would start, you start the fire in here, you get your coal in there. Once it gets going, you're going to feed it with air, which will make it even hotter. There we go. So if you watch the forge, when I pull on this, it's going to operate these bellows up here. And you can see that the double bellows, when I pull it, one chamber is going to fill with air while the other expels. When the one is done, the other one will expel. So you have this. The forge here, you'll see, when I pull it, you'll see some dust come up from. Now, normally we would take that plate off of there, but you can kind of see the air blowing through there. It's kind of moving some of those coals. And that will get that coal so that it almost gets white hot. And you can see the bellows as they operate. Bringing in air. Just a gigantic lung. And so when we have the fifth graders here, one of them or two of them gets assigned to this. They usually rotate it as a squad. And someone is constantly on this, keeping that coal real hot. And they'll put their steel pieces in there, heat them up, and then pull them out and shape them, bend them. And they'll typically be bent on these anvils here. So you can see all our blacksmith tools, various tools and tongs for handling the hot items. And you might have a blacksmith here. Let's see. So you'll have a little piece of, who knows what they're working on. These are hardy tools. These will sit in here to form items. So for example, this looks like something he might have worked on, and it might come out of there as a flat piece, and they're going to have to roll it and sharpen it. It looks like it was probably meant to be a peg to hold some items, to hang some items on. But you can imagine, over the course of perhaps an hour or so, the blacksmith's going to pull a flat piece of steel out of there, and he'll be pounding on this, right? Some of this we can do by cold iron. They'll pound on this. And I love that sound. That's the blacksmiths refer to their anvil as singing. No two anvils have the same sound. They all have their own unique voice in a way. And the more you use them, the better they get, I think. So items like that, you'll see them in here. Sometimes if it's a big item, something that belongs to Wagon, you'll have a couple guys holding items while a couple of them are pounding on it, moving it. Because as soon as it's, you got to work on it. When you pull it out of there, it starts cooling right away. And so you got to pound. You've heard the old saying, hit while the iron's hot, right? Comes from blacksmithing. You got to strike it and work on it while it's hot. You got to go, and they'll have to reheat it, and then they'll dunk in our dunking tank when they need to cool it off a bit. Right? You notice here, you got a big gigantic tank full of water. And at the bottom is probably all sorts of iron shards and pieces that come off the iron when they cool it. And they take that iron with the tongs, dunk it in there. When you dunk it in there, it makes a sizzling sound. And then you can see all sorts of stock here. So that little piece I was showing you that they were working on probably came off of one of these pieces back here. Here's our supply. You can see all sorts. We've got square stock and round stock, and flat stock, and really big stock. You know, oh, here's some of our old horseshoes. So here's some of the old shoes that they pulled off the horses. This one actually had a little padding on it, some leather, the old nails. And that would have been taken from that stock and shaped as well, right in this place here. Here's a shovel that they had to work on. They actually had to weld the shovel. Not as a blacksmith, you could weld that. So there was a part that broke along here. They had to heat it up and weld it back in one piece. So these are the things that would have kept these tradesmen busy, and they had to assign soldier specialists here to keep the fighting command ready to go if they're called on by the President or Congress.
So here's a little bit better view of the bellows up here, and you can see the pipe running down to go into the back of the forge.
And in the bucket there, we have lead weights that help pull the bellows back open. I pull it up and it inflates and then pulls itself back down. One lung inflates while one lung pushes air out. Fans the fire.
Here you can see, obviously, they would need to wear some sort of protection from some of the hot embers or metal flying. Here's some leather aprons.
Yep. So you have these aprons, protective gear. If you're working on it, one of those coals or pieces of hot iron gets in here, even wool, it'll burn through it or burn you. So protective gear, PPE, as we call it today. Let me show you some of the good coal over here as well.
They didn't have anything like safety glasses back then, did they? Or did they?
No, they did not.
There was a pride, and that's why you have the guilds. You have the guilds that represent these craftsmen and their skills and what they bring to society. And in this case, literally, these are craftsmen, but they're helping maintain a fighting command, which, if it's called upon, defends the Republic. So you can kind of translate where there is a sense of purpose and honor in their crafts. Yeah. Let me show you this. We came across. This is kind of neat. Maybe I'll put on the forge here so you can with the sun. Those are kind of, we use that, our blacksmiths use that to show the kids the varying levels of heat. The color of your iron will tell you about how hot it is. So you can see at the top here, you're close to melting. Right above here would be start to get white, and when it gets to that white color, your steel starts sparkling. When it's sparkling, it is melting, right? So and you'll notice right here, we are at 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? When it starts off, nose down here, just black with maybe a tiny touch of red, that's 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So one of the safety measures that we've talked about, that I'm sure these guys all learned very quickly, was you don't just because a piece of iron looks like it's cold, that could still be 1,000 degrees. It could be 600 degrees. If I touch that with my hand, for half a second, it's going to burn me for life. It'll scar you. So a lot of times, for example, some of our safety procedures are you'll feel it with the back of your hand. If you can feel the heat, because it tends to be more sensitive, you can feel the heat, better grab one of those tongs or talk to the blacksmith first before you just go ahead and grab it. Just as an example. But what's really neat is a good blacksmith kind of knows where his iron is by the color it's assumed. Table. So they do a lot of work on here. This is a vise that you'll use. The blacksmith likes to heat these up with the kids a lot. They'll take this to probably maybe 1,800 degrees or so, and they'll secure it in here, and then they will take it and they will shape it into basically a basic Escort. Now, the kids are not going to be making like wagon parts just yet. It takes a little training. But what they'll typically do is they'll take a flat piece of iron or iron like this, turn it into an Escort. When you go camping, you can hang this over your campfire and hang your cooking utensils. Very practical, right off the bat, right? But let me, as I've been promising, let me show you a quick piece of coal. So we have our coal supply back here. Let me grab a couple so we can see them well. So this is unburned coal. This all has potential to burn and to get our steel in excess of 2,500 degrees. It's a good unburned coal compared to that clinker you saw earlier.
Where did their coal have to come from?
Well, our coal comes from a company in San Francisco right now. The coal back then would have been mined either out here, or the Army might have had a supplier back east that they might have shipped either across land or by ship and unloaded as well. Now, they're not using copious quantities of coal because it's not heating the fork. They're using wood for that. But they would have been using coal for the wood just won't get the steel hot enough to work with full will. So it was being shipped by the Army. They would have contracted with miners here in the West, or the Army might have had contractors elsewhere that eventually shipped it in all those wagons that were constantly coming out here to Fort Tejon. So any questions about the wheelwright farrier blacksmith shop?
Yeah, this is really nice to see.
Yeah. Well, and it belongs to you guys. This is all part of the Fort Tejon State Park.
So is this piece that we're looking at now used for bending the tires?
Yes, this would help shape the tires. And by tire, I don't mean the entire wheel. I mean the outer wheel rim on the wheels to the wagon. So if you see right here,
It's an iron tire, is that right?
it is. We have a wheel made of a good, I think this is ash. It has the bearings inside as well. But then the tire itself is actually this metal piece that has to be heated up, shaped, and then fitted tightly to the wheel. Now, I've heard an account by one of the officers here when he was traveling west, where he saw a wagon, California's wagon, and somehow they did a temporary repair on the wheel using leather, believe it or not. And he was so fascinated, he said he stayed behind to watch them do it. But typically the Army wagons, most of the wagons you see today that are left over from that era, typically have a steel tire on them.
Now the leather, you would get it wet and then you put it around, let it dry in the hot sun, and it gets real hard.
Yes, you're right. And as it
Holds
cools,
the wheels together.
put it on fairly hot, but then as it cools, it's going to shrink and provide a tight fit to your wheel.
Mm-hmm.
Another remedy, also, you'll hear a lot of times in old passages where when the wagons would cross streams or rivers, they would stop. They would just stop in the middle of a river or stream because they wanted the wheels to soak, to kind of tighten up. And so for us, we don't always do that where we dunk them in the Grapevine Creek. We'll treat them with typically boiled linseed oil, which was a period remedy as well. And that gets in the wood, not only kind of, I guess, re-moistens it, but also kind of helps preserve the wood. Good question. Any other questions about our wheelwright farrier blacksmith shop?
Let me check and see. We had some people chatting, so let's see what we've got here. Does the color of the anvil affect things in a way? I've only seen black anvils.
Oh, good point. No, what kind of paint you have on the anvil, as far as I know, I've never heard a blacksmith telling me that the color of their anvil has anything to do with it. Most of them are made of a very, very hard, like armor, kind of steel, because you're pounding it on with hot, heavy stuff, constantly, they have to take a beating. Some of the old anvils you see after a while all have their own character depending on how they were used. If you use different materials, and I imagine it would shape the color, but most anvils today, and especially 150 years ago, were being made with steel, which tends to make that kind of black, silver, ferrous, somewhat reddish color. We do have one in anvil back there that was painted red, but that's just a paint. But that's a good question.
So here's a couple of the other anvils. You can see this one is just on a trunk of a tree.
Yeah.
How much do they weigh?
What's that?
How much do the anvils weigh?
Well, this one back here, the one you're looking at now, the red one, that's 155 pounds. The one that you were just looking at is about 125. The one across the way over here is about 155 to 165.
So the first one that we could hear that you were working the metal on, that's about 155 pounds?
Yeah, that's about 155, 165 pounds right there. And then back there is probably another about 125, 112 pounder. So these are actually pretty big anvils by today's standard. They cost quite a bit. These are ones that we have acquired through various sources over the decades as we build our interpretive blacksmith shop. How old some of these are, I'm not sure. Some of them are marked and some of them are not marked. If a lot of the old English ones have a style, well, they have a certain numbers on them, and the numbers were supposed to be how many stones, ounces, and pounds, and so on they weighed. Most of these have been made, I think all of these were made here in the U.S. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us. I'm going to join Mike over here on this side.
You want to go out the door here?
Right. Thank you so much.
Oh, our pleasure.
Well, thank you for joining us today. And next time we're going to go to the kind of junior officers' quarters, the band quarters, the Peter Lebec tree, which has a very interesting history that predates the fort.
Yep.
So prior to 1854. And the bakery and some water cisterns and a variety of other structures here at the fort. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Take
you.
care, everybody. Thanks, John.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.